the sky filled with contrails twisting like white scars against the blue. Pilots like Commander Dave McCampbell, who would become one of the Navy's greatest aces, methodically carved through the incoming formations. The battle seemed to move in slow motion for the Americans. Radar plots, altitude dominance, overwhelming firepower, coordinated divisions, every advantage stacked on their side. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Vratsiu, lagging behind due to a supercharger malfunction, stumbled upon a cluster of enemy dive bombers heading for the fleet. He attacked with ruthless efficiency, firing conservative bursts, letting the tracers walk across the sky like the strokes of an angry painter. 6 bombers fell in minutes. It was one of the most stunning individual performances of the war. The photograph taken moments after he landed Vratsiu still in flight gear. Raising 6 fingers would become part of naval aviation lore. Few knew that his aircraft's wings were only partially locked during the mission. Even fewer cared. The day was becoming a legend. The battle continued in waves, 3rd, 4th, each smaller and more disorganized than the last. Some Japanese pilots wandered off course entirely. Others turned back early, fuel gauges sinking toward empty. A handful reached Guam, only to be attacked as they tried to land. Many died without ever seeing the American ships they'd been ordered to destroy. And yet the Americans were not untouchable. Men like Commander Charles Brewerskild, respected, fell during the chaos. The ocean swallowed his aircraft, a reminder that war's arithmetic, no matter how lopsided, always demanded payment. By noon, the air above the Philippine Sea belonged entirely to the Hellcats. The Japanese had launched hundreds of aircraft. The Americans had destroyed nearly all of them. The sky was quiet again, too quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over a battlefield when the scale of victory becomes indistinguishable from tragedy. Oil slicks drifted across the water. Parachutes floated like wilted flowers. A few Japanese pilots clung to life rafts, watching the horizon for rescue that would never come. Admiral Marc Mitscher, standing on Lexington's flag bridge, surveyed the aftermath. His staff waited for his assessment. The lines on his face, carved by years of command, seemed deeper in that moment. What he said was simple, almost soft, yet it would define the day forever. The Japanese carrier air arm, he said, was finished. And in truth, it was. The Hellcat, with its heavy armor, massive engine, and 6 roaring guns, had not merely defeated the Zero, it had outgrown an era. Here on this quiet sea, the future of naval aviation had arrived, and Japan's hopes of reversing the war had vanished. Beneath the waves, afternoon, shadows stretched long across the decks of Task Force 58, the metal warming beneath, the rising sun as though the ships themselves exhaled after hours of relentless tension. But for the men aboard, there was no relief, only a growing awareness. That victory in the air was not enough. A decisive blow still remained to be struck. The Japanese fleet was retreating, limping westward, wounded yet still afloat. And the Americans knew that if darkness fell before they launched a counterstrike, the enemy might vanish back into the vastness of the Pacific, protected by night and distance. On the flag bridge of USS Lexington, Admiral Marc Mitscher weighed his options. He understood naval aviation better than any man alive. He also understood the price of indecision. And so, with the calm of someone who had long reconciled himself to the burdens of command, Mitscher gave the order that would define the afternoon. "Launch everything we have." It was a sentence shaped by necessity and sharpened by risk. Never before and never again would the U.S. Navy send such a massive strike force so far so late in the day, pushing fuel limits and daylight to their frayed edges. The pilots would be flying into the mouth of twilight, and they all knew it. Below deck, flight crews ran with the urgency of men trying to outrun time. Bombs were hoisted into cradles and locked beneath wings. Torpedoes gleamed in the piercing sunlight, their brass fins catching reflections of the restless waves. Avgas hoses hissed. Engines coughed to life. And one by one, the aircraft rolled forward. Hellcats, Helldivers, Avengers, a symphony of war tuned for one final act. At 16:20, the first aircraft thundered down the deck and lifted into the fading afternoon sky. More followed, hundreds forming, a constellation of American steel, spreading out across the horizon. In the cockpits, pilots felt the weight of Mitscher's gamble. The flight would take them far too far. Fuel gauges would sink toward empty before they returned. Some would never return at all. But the mission was clear: strike the Japanese carriers while they were exposed, vulnerable and desperately trying to escape. As the formations leveled off at cruising altitude, the pilots began scanning the horizon. The Pacific Sea stretched endlessly beneath them, a shimmering tapestry of blue and silver, broken only by the faint, ghost-like trails left by distant wakes. Then just as hope began to fray, the lookout in the lead section saw it. Smoke. A thin ribbon at first, rising like a question against the pale sky. Then more. Shapes in the distance hulls moving in jagged lines, zigzagging in a defensive weave. The Japanese mobile fleet. Helldiver pilots tightened their harnesses. Torpedo crews whispered short prayers. And the fighter escorts, the Hellcats, took their positions high and wide, ready to clear the way. The attack began with the precision of a striking falcon. From 12,000 feet, the Helldivers peeled off, their wings trembling as they plunged toward the carriers below. Air screamed across their canopies. The ocean spiraled upward in a dizzying blur. Bomb bays opened. The pilots held steady against the gravitational crush. Then, in carefully timed intervals, they released their payloads. Explosions blossomed across the water like molten flowers. The Japanese carrier Hio took one bomb amidships, the shock wave ripping through her hangar decks. Another hit ignited fuel lines. Within minutes, she listed sharply, her bow dipping toward the sea. Smoke roared upward in columns thick enough to blot out the sky. Meanwhile, torpedo squadrons raced in low, skimming the waves, engines throttling at full power. Japanese destroyers unleashed frantic volleys of anti-aircraft fire. The sea churned with fountains of shrapnel. Yet the Avengers pressed on, slipping between curtains of overcast steel. One torpedo found its mark on Chiyoda. Another struck Haruna, the impact thundering through her hull like a hammer blow. Even the Japanese battleship's massive. Armored titans could not ignore the punishment. Above the chaos, the Hellcats fought the last remnants of Japanese fighter cover. What they encountered was not the fierce resistance of earlier years, but a scattering of exhausted pilots, many with less than 60 hours of flight time. They charged forward with bravery, but bravery alone cannot bend physics. The Hellcats tore through them with clinical finality. By the time the strike ended, the Japanese fleet was in ruins. Ships burned. Survivors clung to floats and debris. Oil stained the surface of the Pacific in thick black sheets, and the sun now slipping toward the horizon cast the destruction, in the orange glow of a world on fire. But triumph gave way to dread. The American aircraft had flown too far. Nightfall was coming fast, and the fleet was still hundreds of miles away. Fuel needles hovered near empty. Engines sputtered lightly. Pilots glanced at their maps, then at the sinking sun, then at each other. They knew many would not make it home. For the first time that day, fear returned. As the sun disappeared beyond the curve of the sea, Admiral Mitscher stood once more on the flag bridge. He knew the danger. He knew the regulations. And he knew what he had to do. He turned to his staff. "Turn on the lights." It was an act unheard of. Madness, some would have said. Lighting the decks of the carrier fleet invited submarines from hundreds of miles around. It made the task force visible to anyone watching the horizon. It risked everything, but Mitscher was not risking ships. He was trying to save his men. Across the task force, carrier crews switched on searchlights, deck floods, signal lamps, every light source available. The darkness erupted into sudden brilliance, a floating city burning with artificial daylight. A beacon to the hundreds of American aviators still struggling through the blackness. For the pilots, that glow became a salvation. At first, they saw only a faint halo on the horizon. Then the glow sharpened, brightened, spreading like the rising sun. Some wept. Others laughed in disbelief. All pushed their failing engines toward the light. They arrived in chaos, fuel-starved, engines coughing, nerves frayed. Carrier decks slammed with incoming aircraft. Some landing hard, some bouncing, some breaking apart as wheels collapsed. A few ditched alongside the ships, the splash illuminated by the deck lights above. Still, the rescue teams worked tirelessly, pulling men from the water, guiding crippled aircraft to safety. It was not a landing operation. It was a recovery of survivors. By the time the last engines fell silent, Task Force 58 had executed one of the most extraordinary nighttime recoveries in naval history. Not all returned, but far more survived than anyone had dared hope. When the sun rose the following morning, the Pacific was calm, as though unaware of the war it had witnessed. The Japanese carrier air armaments, the pride of the empire, no longer existed in any meaningful form. Its pilots were gone, its planes destroyed, its doctrine shattered. The Americans had not merely won a battle, they had ended an era. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would forever be remembered by another name, spoken first by a pilot with equal parts astonishment and dark humor. The Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot. But beneath the legend, beneath the numbers and the anecdotes and the lore, lay a deeper truth. This was the moment when air power became destiny, when the future of naval warfare turned its gaze toward the sky, and when the Hellcat, born in the urgency of a world at war, completed its evolution from machine into myth. Dawn returned slowly on June 20th, as though hesitant to illuminate the aftermath of the previous day's storm. The Philippine Sea's alive with the roar of engines, the flash of explosions. The spiraling descent of burning aircraft now stretched in stillness. A quiet ocean, deceptively calm, masking the remnants of a battle that had reshaped the war's horizon. The American carriers steamed in steady formation, their wakes trailing behind them like long white scars. Aboard the ships, exhausted men walked, the decks with the heaviness of those who had seen the thin edge of fate and returned from it. The night rescue had taken its toll. Dozens of aircraft lay mangled across the hangar decks, their wings bent, their wheels sheared off, their fuselages fractured by desperate landings. Some wrecks still dripped seawater, others still smelled of scorched oil from engines that had died moments after touching down. But alive, the pilots had made it back. Word of Mitscher's decision to turn on the lights had rippled through the fleet, whispered with a reverence usually reserved for saints or legendary captains of old. Sailors spoke of it in hushed tones, as if recounting an act too bold, too generous, too human to fully comprehend. In a war defined by steel, fire, and relentless mechanized logic, the simple illumination of a carrier deck had become a symbol of something profoundly rare, compassion in the heart of strategy. Yet war has little patience for reflection. With the Japanese carrier air arms shattered, the American combat veterans home to teach the next wave itself. How do you strike a foe who has already been broken? The answer was written not in orders or maps, but in the psyche of war. You pursue, you press. You finish the work that fate has placed in your hands. As Task Force 58 reorganized, intelligence officers pored over intercepted signals, assessing the battered remnants of the Japanese mobile fleet. They found what they expected: retreat, chaos, a withdrawal marked not by discipline but by desperation. The carriers Taiho and Shokakuikans of Japan's naval might were gone, swallowed by the depths after internal. Explosions tore through their fuel-laden hulls. Hyo, too, had slipped beneath the waves, her decks exploding in a pillar of flame that illuminated the sky like a funeral pyre. Only a few remained afloat, damaged, slowed, bleeding. And it was the Americans' duty to ensure these survivors never again threatened the Pacific. Aboard USS Enterprise, the flight crews prepared for another strike. The men moved with a practiced rhythm, their bodies weary yet determined. They had witnessed the disappearance of an entire enemy air force. Now they sought the ships that had launched it. Enterprise's aviators veterans, hardened by years of attritions trapped into cockpits that felt familiar as home. The smell of hydraulics and hot metal, the cramped pressure of flight gear, the ritual of checking gauges, switches, harness locks. Each step was a covenant with survival. By mid-morning, the first squadrons lifted off. Their shadows darted across the water in long, sweeping shapes, phantoms racing toward destiny. Below, the sea reflected the sky with unsettling clarity. An endless blue, mirror broken only by the faint black streaks of burning oil in the far distance. The pilots scanned that horizon, searching for the final targets of the Philippine Sea campaign. Hours passed. The scorching heat shimmered across cockpit glass. Sweat trickled beneath flight suits, pooling in gloves and boots. Some pilots nodded off momentarily, snapped awake by turbulence or radio chatter. Fatigue had become a living presence in the aircraft, whispering reminders of the night they had survived. Then a voice crackled through the headset. "Contact! Ships ahead!" Eyes that had grown heavy sharpened instantly. There, on the horizon, thin, vertical silhouettes began to grow against the haze: warships, destroyers, cruisers, and, at the center of the defensive screen, the carrier Zuikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor Coral Sea, and Santa Cruz, one of the last surviving giants of the Imperial Navy. The Americans tightened formation. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. Helldivers dove first, shrieking toward the carrier decks. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns opened fire in bursts of black and orange fury, filling the sky with explosions that rattled aircraft frames and made the air itself seem hostile. But the gunners were few, tired, inexperienced, and the Americans had come with intent. Bombs tore through Zuikaku's flight deck, igniting secondary fires deep within her corridors. Her listing grew worse by the minute, her bow sinking toward the sea. The ship that had witnessed the opening blow of the war now approached her final chapter. Meanwhile, the Avengers lined up for torpedo runs. The sea exploded in great geysers. Around the carrier's hull as torpedoes found their marks. Vibrations tore through the Japanese vessel. Plates buckled. Bulkheads shrieked under pressure. At last, Zuikaku could endure no more. Her proud flight deck aunts crowded with Zeros ready to defend an empire now lay torn open, flames licking across its length like hungry spirits. Below, the ocean waited, and it claimed her. The once mighty carrier rolled onto her side, her rising stern pointing briefly toward the sun, before she slipped beneath the waves, a final groan echoing across the sea. The Japanese sailors who survived watched their ship vanish, stunned by the suddenness of it. Many saluted as she went under. Others wept. Across the airwaves, American pilots listened to their carrier frequency fall silent. The Pacificons filled with the buzzing of aircraft and the thunder of gunshot, grown quiet again. The strike force turned home. Behind them, columns of smoke twisted into the sky, marking graves of steel. Ahead lay the long flight back to the carriers, another test of endurance, as fuel gauges trembled near empty, and the afternoon sun beat heavily against the canopy glass. This time, the landing operation was calmer. No frantic nighttime search. No engines coughing out their final breaths. Only the steady rhythm of disciplined landings, each pilot touching down with the weight of victory in their hearts and the fatigue of survival in their bones. When the last aircraft rolled to a stop, deck crews and pilots exchanged tired nods. No cheers, no applause. Only a quiet acknowledgement that they had lived through something monumental. Later that evening, standing on his flag bridge, Admiral Mitscher stared across the dim horizon. The glow of scattered fires on the water illuminated the dark like distant lanterns. He knew what the day meant. The Pacific Fleet had achieved in 2 days what strategists once believed impossible. Japan's naval air power, once the sharpest sword in its arsenal, had been cut away. Without trained pilots, without carriers, without aircraft to defend their remaining fleet, Japan had lost the ability to dictate the war's tempo. From that point onward, they could only react. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was more than a triumph of technology or tactics. It was the moment when the scales of the Pacific tipped irreversibly. It was the proof that industrial might, when paired with training, discipline, and air superiority, could overcome even the most spirited opponents. For the men who fought, it would be remembered not only as victory, but as a turning point in their lives. The Hellcat pilotsmen who had taken to the sky with courage, tempered by duty, knew that they had witnessed the twilight of one era and the dawn of another. They had seen the final roar of the Zero. They had seen the last stand of Japan's elite air arm. They had seen carriers burn, sink, and vanish beneath the waves. And when they looked back on the Philippine Sea, it was with a mixture of pride, sorrow, and awe. History would later name it with a tone both mocking and clinical. The great Mariana's turkey shoot, but those who were there knew better. They knew of the long flights through darkness, the desperate landings, the silence in the ready rooms as pilots waited for the names of those who hadn't returned. The bravery etched into the faces of both sides, and they understood that war's brutality is never as simple as its nicknames. For in the Philippine Sea, far from home, beneath an indifferent sky, men on both sides had given everything they had for causes larger than themselves. When the sea finally grew quiet, it held their stories in its depths. Stories of courage, stories of loss, stories of the machines they flew and the decisions that shaped their fate. Stories that would echo through the annals of naval history as long as men remembered the war that defined a generation. June 19th, 1944. Dawn crept over the Philippine Sea like a pale, uncertain witness, its horizon bruised with the remnants of night. out there beyond the reach of continents, where wind carried only salt and premonition. The world's largest carrier armada unfurled across the water Task Force 58, a moving continent of steel preparing to determine the future of the Pacific War. For hours, the decks had echoed with the metallic rhythm of men readying their machines. Hellcats, nearly 500 of them, stood in rows, folded like predatory birds conserving strength before the flight. Their blue paint still wore the scent of oil and sun-baked metal. Their engines, when turned over, growled with the certainty of well-trained killers. And above them, radar screens flickered with the green pulse of distant movement, each echo a promise that the day ahead would test the architecture of American airpower like never before. Maps glowed under trembling hands, as if the paper itself feared the orders written on it. The Pacific had been a proving ground for myths. For 3 years, the Mitsubishi Zero had seemed untouchable, a nimble phantom whose pilots fought with the devotion of men raised to see death not as fate, but as a form of duty. Yet on this morning, the Zero's legend stood at the edge of extinction, threatened not by luck or chance, but by the relentless, engineered logic of the F6F Hellcat, the searchlights. Carved the dawn open like scalpels, the American carrier decks buzzed with purpose. Men who had flown through the storms of earlier battles Midway, Santa Cruz, the long attrition in the Solomons felt something different in the air. The Hellcat was no longer the new arrival fighting to prove itself. It had become the backbone of a doctrine built on radar, coordination, and overwhelming firepower. It was the spear point of an industrial giant that could train, equip, and sustain an air force at a tempo the Japanese Empire could no longer match. Below deck, in a cramped ready room aboard USS Lexington, pilots sat shoulder to shoulder, flight gear resting like armor across their laps. Cigarette smoke curled toward the ceiling in thin, nervous spirals. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vraciu reviewed his plotting board one last time. He had flown through the war's darkest days, losing friends, mentors, and pieces of his early confidence. Today he felt none of that. Today, he felt the weightless clarity that comes when a pilot knows he is flying the best. Machine in the sky far to the west, the Japanese First Mobile Fleet was advancing with grim determination. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded 9 carriers, including the new Taihohi's Pride, the symbol of Japan's last bid to reverse the tide. But numbers disguised the truth. The pilots filling Ozawa's flight decks were boys. Many had never fired their guns in training. Their flight hours were counted in dozens, not hundreds. And they faced Americans, whose training system had grown into a war machine of its own one. They rotated combat veterans home to teach the next wave, preserving experience like a currency. The silence after artillery felt heavier than the shells themselves. At 07:45, a distant submarine made the first cut in Japan's hopes. USS Albacore, prowling beneath the waves, fired a spread of torpedoes at Taiho. One young Japanese aviator, seeing the wakes streaking toward the flagship, dove his aircraft directly into a torpedo to stop it. His sacrifice destroyed one. Another struck home. The damage seemed modest at first, but fuel vapors, those silent saboteurs, of steel hulls began to seep through. Ventilation ducts. Taiho would not survive the day. Still, the air battle had not yet begun. At 08:30, radar operators aboard. Task Force 58 leaned forward as a bloom of movement appeared on their scopes. Dozens of enemy aircraft. Then more still. Japan had launched the first of 4 massive strike waves. Each one was meant to hammer the American carriers into submission. Instead, they were flying into a gauntlet. The fighter directors acted without hesitation. Calm voices, honed by endless drills, spoke into headsets, vectors, altitude calls, bearing updates guidance shaped with the precision of chess moves. They could see the entire sky plotted in green arcs and shifting symbols. The Japanese could see nothing beyond the cockpit glass. Hellcats climbed in layered arcs, their wings cutting clean lines through the air. At altitude, the Pacific horizon looked deceptively peaceful, but the men knew what approached. And when the first faint glint of sunlight caught the leading edge of the Japanese formation, the interception began. From above, the Hellcats fell like hawks. The Japanese pilots maintained tight formation on approach, disciplined but tragically predictable. They flew straight and level, honoring a doctrine shaped in earlier warswares fought before radar, before proximity fuses, before pilots could die without ever seeing their killers. The Hellcats entered the formations with disciplined violence. Their 650 caliber guns spat bright, converging rivers of tracers that stitched through wings and engines. Dive bombers crumpled, their sudden flames reflecting off still cool morning water. Fighters spiraled downward with smoke tails unraveling behind them like dark. Handwriting drawn across the wind. Some American pilots later said they were shocked by how little maneuvering the enemy attempted. Others felt a cold sadness. They knew these young men were flying into the teeth of a machine. They could neither outfight nor outrun. One by one, Japanese planes dropped away. By the time the remnants of the first wave reached the American ships, the fleet's anti-aircraft, guns armed with proximity-fused shells, finished. What the Hellcats had begun. The second wave fared even worse. At 09 Lao, another mass of enemy aircraft appeared on radar. But Task Force 58's defenders were already airborne, ready and organized.